Good evening and welcome to our Community Budget Committee meeting. And tonight we want to say thank you all so very much for coming, and we think we have addressed the questions that came from the last meeting, and we are ready to get started. So I'll turn the time over to Deputy Superintendent Roaring.
Thank you, Superintendent Adams. We're moving on to our next topics of discussion this evening, which includes an update on our budget process, any adjustments that we've made to the rollover expense, what the revenue looks like with the governor's proposed budget, and a little highlight of what she's included. Looking at our budget calendar, we have a couple of budget updates coming up with the Board of Education. February 10th will be the first one, and then into March. We have a virtual community budget presentation scheduled for March 24th that will allow us to receive some input from the community prior to formalizing the proposed budget, which is due to the board on April 7th. We'll have some additional community budget presentation sessions, and our vote will be on May 17th. As a reminder, this year we did a modified rollover budget, and those assumptions include continuation of existing programs and services, contractual obligations, operations, and staffing and benefits under labor contracts. It also includes absorption of programs and staffing that have been identified from the one-time federal funds. It does not include new funding or staffing requests submitted for fiscal year 22-23, addressing any mandates that require more resources, or other items considered to be essential for programming health and safety. The modified rollover budget adjustments include renewing our HVAC preventive maintenance contract, pool maintenance contract, summer school being returned to the general fund. This is continuing to be reviewed a little bit more closely to see what opportunities we may have. Extended day or night school funded at the 2019-20 level. We've added some behavioral specialist positions and some additional mandated nursing positions as part of 21-22. We have also increased funding for software licenses to build those in that have been funded by grants over the last couple of years, increased our hardware budget line to support the Chromebook replacement schedule that we are now a one-to-one district, and increased funding for hall monitor and maintenance overtime to support programming and facilities use as would be more typical under district operations, which we are hoping to return to in 22-23. Adjustments that have been made to the modified rollover that was shared with the board in January include employees' retirement system, employer contribution rate adjustment that has brought that down. Adjustments in position, including those that may be absorbed from one-time federal dollars. We've made some adjustments in which positions those are. And then we've been notified of an increase in BOCES expenses in a couple of areas, and those have been accounted for as well. So for February 22, our modified rollover budget stands at $287,586,411, which is a difference of just over $17.3 million from the adopted budget for 21-22, and it is an increase of 6.4%. When we shared this information with you at our first meeting, we were at an increase of about 8%, so we've been able to bring that down. One of the questions last meeting was around staffing by bargaining unit, and what we share in this table is reflective of those positions that are in the general fund budget for fiscal year 2021, which was our last school year, 21-22, which is our current school year, and planned for 22-23 at this time in the modified rollover budget. I did want to highlight that the 2020-21 numbers are reflective of the reductions in force that we did in September of 2020. So that number of 1321.8 was where we were for that year until we were able to do some restorations in the late spring. One of the other questions raised at the last meeting was around social emotional learning positions and what the trajectory for those positions has been. So we were able to provide a 4-year timeline on those positions, and you'll see that we did have the dip during the 2020-21 school year, but we have been restoring those positions, and we project 22-23 at this time to be a total of 135. We also wanted to share out retirement information. At this time, the district has been notified of just about 41 retirements, 1 administrator, 29 faculty positions, and then 11 support positions. We're still looking at what that means for our budget, whether some of those positions might be absorbed by attrition or whether or not we'll realize some savings in salary offset. Did we want to stop there for questions before we go on to the governor's budget? Or
I would also like to add that when we talk about positions, we've had a number of positions that have been vacant all year. And so by them being vacant all year, we've had to have workarounds in terms of how we still provide those services. And so those also may be positions that we realize that, you know, when you balance out with your retirements and looking at vacancies, what can we absorb via attrition, but also what do we need to bring back to make sure that we hire for those positions. The vacancies, typically when those workarounds have been already, those concessions have already been made with regard to how do we accomplish those services, that's more likely where we would have attrition in those positions, and we may not hire for those positions because we have workarounds for that. The retirements are a little bit different in that there may be some that we would absorb those positions, but many of those retirements we would be looking to rehire for them depending on the courses that we're talking about. So we have to look at that individually and see the impact on the organization in terms of whether we would be filling those positions or whether we would be able to absorb the cost of those positions. Any questions about where we are or the staffing slides? Ms. Tanya, if you could back up a little bit to the general fund budget FTE by year. Yes, that one. Next one. Moving forward, I'm sorry, moving forward. Yes, that one. So you can see that even with the reductions that we had, and we did have a report that HR presented during their district update with regard to the positions that we were able to bring back when we had the reduction in force. And we have, other than those that were non-return, we did have significant portion of those positions. Those positions were all brought back. And so now you're looking at moving forward as to where we are looking for the 22-23 school year. Okay, if there are no questions, then I think we can, let's go to the next slide and just make sure that there are no questions on the SEL positions. Any questions with regard to the social emotional positions? Dahlia, we can't hear you. You can unmute, or do I need to? Hold on just a second. Okay, there you go. You can unmute now.
Thank you. I just wanted to understand the 22-23, both on the positions you were talking about before, but particularly this one. We're still talking about the modified rollover budget, right? I mean, you know,
yes.
What I'm trying to understand is the 22-20, for example, on the behavior specialist in 2019-20, we had 19 behavior specialists, and it's saying for 22-23 right now is 18. And I have a feeling that that's one of those things, especially when looking at the executive budget, which has another, I think, $100 million for this, or social emotional support, that will be increased. I just wanted to clarify that this is still modified rollover budget.
Yes, it is still the modified rollover budget.
Okay. Thank you.
I just unmuted you, Ms. Zimmerman. I just unmuted you.
Oh, thank you. I have a question about the, how's it said, APSU positions, because there's a lot more, which is great. So we will be up to 531 next year. And I am a little confused in my mind. I know there are contracts that are negotiated, but there seem like there have been a lot of changes as we've moved through the pandemic, you know, public schools, private schools, but in terms of those salaries. And I wondered if, you know, it looks like we have a lot more. Has there been a significant change in those contract negotiations for salary, since some of those have been a little bit hard to either like attain or retain, like in terms of janitors and hall monitors and that kind of thing?
So our contract with APSU, I think it expires, Ms. Roaring, you can help me with that one. I think it's in 2023, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe we finished in 2024.
24?
We negotiated that last year, and it was a 4-year agreement. So I think we go through the 23-24 school year with them. When the contract negotiations were finalized last spring and they ratified the contract, it did include their salary schedules for all the positions.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Bowie, can we move on to the governor's budget, please? So Governor Hochul has presented her budget for 22-23. That did include a $2.1 billion increase in education funding. Of that, $1.6 billion was intended to fund the foundation aid increases, and $466 million was for other programs. Year 2 of the 3-year path to fully funding foundation aid is this year for 22-23. So they are anticipated to provide half of that balance that's remaining in 22-23, and then the final allotment in 23-24. It does continue our community school set aside within our foundation aid total of $4.4 million. It also fully funds all the expense-based aids, including transportation, public and private excess cost, building aid, and BOCES aid at $464 million. It continues all the categorical aids at the same per student allocation for textbooks, software, hardware, and library materials. It does include a charter school tuition rate increase of 4.7%. And as we heard a little bit of, there is a new program embedded in this budget proposal. It does provide $100 million over 2 years to school districts in a matching fund way for social, emotional, and academic supports for students. The district has to match with ARP fund. And it does look like that may be some sort of application or competitive grant process. We're waiting for some additional information to come forward and how that program would be established and administered. In terms of revenue sources, as we build that side of the budget, we have local, state, federal, and other. Our local revenue resources are derived from our property taxes, tax on utilities, and then our pilot payments, which are payment in lieu of taxes. Our state resources include the STAR reimbursement, our foundation aid, categorical aid, and BOCES special services aid. Our federal resources include Medicaid assistance, E-rate, and this year, I need to correct that, we do not have pandemic aid rolled into this estimate. Our other includes our interest earnings, our district billings, appropriated fund balance and reserves, and then rebates and refunds that we are able to receive as part of our health insurance program. Our 22-23 revenue budget, at this time, our initial revenue based on the governor's proposed budget is $285.9 million. This represents a $15.64 million increase over the adopted budget for 21-22. It does continue the use of restricted reserves and appropriated fund balance at $3 million, and it assumes a flat property tax levy at this time. When we look at our revenue by source, you'll be able to see some comparisons here between the 21-22 budgeted revenue and then our 22-23 revenue at this time based on the governor's proposal. We are anticipating at this time a $7,000 decrease due to associated decrease in interest and penalties in the local area. You'll see reflected a $15.3 million increase in our state aid, which is largely attributable to an increase in foundation aid. We also have an increase anticipated in our federal aid of $430,000 that's associated with an increase in Medicaid reimbursement. And then we have a slight decrease in our other category, which is largely attributable to reduced tuition and rental billings, as we have continued to look at how we use the space, and we've had a decrease in use of our space. So that gives us that total of $285.9 million in revenue. We compare that then to the modified rollover budget expense. And right now, the 285.9 revenue is a little bit less than the modified rollover expense assumption. So the difference is $1.67 million. Any questions on that before we move on to the next topic?
Yes, I have a question. I didn't quite understand the thing about the pandemic aid, the federal support. Could you just go over, I thought we were getting funding over a number of years in federal support related to the American Rescue Plan, or did I misunderstand that?
So we are receiving money over multiple years, but it is no longer being accounted for as part of our general fund budget proposal. Those are now required to be accounted for as our special aid revenue source, which actually accounts for most of our federal aid. So those are being accounted for separately. We'll continue to have a plan each year of how those dollars are used. It's just not going to be woven into the revenue estimate for the adopted budget.
Oh, okay. So part of our discussion as we move forward will be about those special funds, though. Am I understanding that correctly? How we're going to use those special funds?
So those funds, if you recall, we did a survey last year with regard to those priorities. And so those funds we've already allocated according to those 5 priorities. And that's SEL at the forefront. We've got technology, we have HVAC, safety and security, and then accelerated learning. So all of that is baked into our Sarissa and ARP funds. And so that's later on in the budget process. We'll be looking at that more specifically because those are funds that are not part of the general fund.
Okay. So again, just for clarification, so going back to the SEL part, you know, you're showing a modified rollover. I was just thinking of the behavior specialist of 19 positions or whatever those positions are. So we can add on, but that's going to be done separately in a separate discussion later on. Am I getting that correctly?
Yes and no. So the yes part is it's part of the ARP funds. However, one of the things that we are looking at doing is absorbing some of those positions into our general fund because we know that those positions need to be permanent. So we can't continue to support them in 3-year money. We need to parcel out how much can we afford to absorb this year? Then next year, how much can we can look to absorb? And so we have been watching that increase, if you will, in staffing to make sure that we are staying within what we're looking at for foundation aid, because as you know, foundation aid is what increases our base funding. That's our general fund money. So we want to make sure that even though we have those increases that are coming for foundation aid, they're pretty much spoken for based on the priorities in ARP so that we can absorb them in the general fund, and then we can have stability in what we're looking at in terms of our staffing. So it's, there's, people tend to think, oh, you have all this money, but it's also the management of the money so that we can have sustainability in what we know and see that's working for our students academically, social emotional learning, and mental health supports, all of those things, safety and security, technology, ventilation and filtration. We know that that money is not indefinite. So we have to, while we're spending that money, we have to look at how is it being rolled in to be absorbed in the general fund so that we can sustain it over time. So there's not this, this whole pot of money that's always going to be out there. It's not going to be out there. And we had to start planning from the beginning. How are we looking to absorb that for sustainability?
Thank you. That was very helpful in terms of clarification.
I have a question. Can you explain to me, and perhaps I missed something, but what exactly is foundation aid?
Foundation aid is the largest allocation within our total state aid that we receive. Foundation aid is typically considered to be general operating aid for school districts. Albany has that community school set aside within there, so our actual foundation aid is a little bit less, by about $4.5 million. But that is general operating aid for the district. It's not specific as to what it's supposed to be spent on. So it helps cover our staffing expense and programmatic expense across a number of areas.
Thank you. And I had a question about the first item where it says the 2.1 billion increase, the 1.6 billion to fund foundation aid, and then 466 million for other programs. Is there any specifics on what those programs are, or and how does that impact our bottom line?
So the 466 also includes the full funding of the categorical aids that I outlined, I think on maybe a next slide, or it might have been before. On slide 12, it does continue to fully fund all those expense-based aids, which is about 464 million is estimated by the governor's office. That includes transportation aid that we receive, public and private excess cost aid that we receive, building aid that we receive, and then we do receive BOCES special services aid. So those are some of the other state aid categories that we receive revenue in to help cover our operating expenses. They are specific for those purposes, but the aid is based on cost.
So when we say programming in that sense, with regard to the categorical aid, this is aid that has been predetermined and specified within our state runs. Programming in terms of academic programming and activities, that falls in foundation aid with our academics. Does that help separate and clear that?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I have another question now that I see the 100 million and that explanation about ARP. So if the governor has 100 million, obviously we'll get a portion of that, and we're to match it with ARP funds. So in one sense, that 2 years, that's all it's really doing is increasing the one-shot deal, because we would still have to, for sustainability purposes, be able to figure out how we can sustain that, right, that level. Am I getting that right?
Yes, if we were to continue to add in alignment with that $100 million item that we're still waiting for some additional information on, that would impact how we assessed sustainability going forward. You know, if we were to add additional positions, we'd have to look at that as we monitor those increases in foundation aid over the next couple of years and what other revenue may be available to us to do so.
Thank you.
Okay. If there aren't any other questions right now on revenue, we can proceed to the debt service topic. Slide 17. So each year the district has debt service expense. It's associated with our capital construction projects on district schools and buildings. This would include construction that is underway as well as construction that has been completed inside of the long-term and short-term. It does include costs for our long-term borrowing, which is bonds, and that is the finished construction. So that may be schools that we finished as far back as 2005. And it also includes our short-term borrowing for the ongoing construction in progress. So for 21-22, that included borrowing for our 5-year plan, as well as North Albany Middle School and Albany High School. For 22-23, it will include borrowing for the completion of North Albany, continuation at Albany High School, and some final elements of the 5-year plan. When we look at our debt service projections, you'll see that we start with the fiscal year and then we look at the total expense that is estimated at this time, the estimated building aid, which acts as a portional offset to that debt service expense, and then that estimated net local share. That's one of the things we watch really closely because that's one of the things that that's the direct impact on the budget. So as we look at next year, we're expecting that to be just under $7.9 million. And then for a couple of years, it'll go down below $7 million. And then it comes back up above $8 million. So as we look at additional work that we need to do and build a new 5-year plan, we're also looking at that flow of debt service and building aid to try and align that in a way that doesn't cause a significant uptick in that expense in the budget. Some of the budget variables we still have as we continue the budget development process include finalization of state aid with the legislative budget, health insurance increases, which we will finalize next month, our tax cap, which we are working through now and will share out at an upcoming meeting with you all. That's finalized at the end of February, and the tax levy is set when the board adopts the budget in April to send to the voters. As I mentioned, with the 41 retirements, we're continuing to assess what that looks like, whether there's attrition or salary savings based on breakage, and then the continuing impact of COVID-19 and how we need to plan for that in our budget next year. As we look at next steps, we are going to continue to incorporate feedback on community priorities, reviewing our projections and budget estimates and assumptions, and respond to questions. Are there any additional questions?
I have one, because I keep forgetting about this. On debt service, is that leaning against the modified rollover budget? Is that part of the budget?
Yes.
Okay.
Debt service is a mandatory expense. The district must pay its obligation. So that is included in the rollover budget as a must continue.
Got it. Thank you.
I guess I still had a question. I probably should have asked it earlier, but I was in transit, so I apologize. Still have a question about the salary piece of the cost drivers on the expense side, which I think last time we met it was about 7 million of the overall 18 million, and I think the question was about how much of that 7 million is accounted for by sort of sunk costs and requirements associated with contractual salary increases. And then how much of it or what percentage of it is the positions that are being moved from 1-year funded positions to the general fund and things that will need to be funded on an ongoing basis. And just ensuring that I had clarity on that piece of it. I don't know if the way it was presented answers that question. I don't know if we asked the question or I asked the question correctly last time.
So I'll start and then Ms. Roaring can chime in. One of the things that we look at are, with regard to the salaries, we have step increases each year according to the contract. So whether a contract is settled or not, there are step increases that are built in on the salary table that we have to account for. So that's accounted for. You have health and benefits that are accounted for. You have retirement pieces that are accounted for. You have things that are ongoing beyond, so for example, when someone retires and they have insurance, all of those things are baked into that. We're not going to be able to distill that out into a granular form, but just understanding that all of those components with regard to salary are all included in that. The other piece with regard to the positions that we are looking at absorbing into the general fund. So we have to do some estimates. There may be some vacant positions where we use a base salary with regard to that. It's just an average salary that we use to look at our vacancies. That way, depending on the person that goes in, that person may be a little higher, they may be a little lower, but we do have an average salary that we use to computate that. And that's just best business practices. We did that in my former district. There's not a business official that doesn't have an average salary amount when you are looking at salaries. And so while the actuals may be a little different from what we project, that's understandable because we do take an average salary and that's what we use. The pieces with ARP, one of the things that we're looking at now, we're looking at how many of those positions based on where we stand with our funding, meaning our general fund, how many of those positions can we absorb? Now, the beauty of that is, at least for those positions, if there are people in the positions, we actually have actual salaries that we can use for those positions, and we don't have to use an average dollar amount. So we are in the process right now of looking at how many of those positions can be absorbed and sustained by this budget. What then do we need to say? So I'll pick an arbitrary number. If I have 20 positions, we may be able to absorb 12 of them now, and then the other 8 positions we may have to carry over another year in ARP, yet planning to absorb them for the next year. And so what that does is whatever that increase in foundation aid, whatever that's going to be for the next year, we know that those 8 positions are going to be right off the top that we're going to have to absorb, along with the mandatory expenses that we have to incur, that we have to cover. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think it's just of that 7 million. How much of that or what percentage of that is currently being estimated to account for those absorbed positions, if that's known at this time? And
that's what we're working on right now. And ARP stands for the American Rescue Plan Act. Those are the federal dollars that were provided to every school district for the pandemic. Ms. Roaring, is there anything to add?
I don't think so, Superintendent Adams.
Okay, I think we can continue.
Oh, that was the end of my presentation. I covered everything. Okay. Are there any additional questions?
I don't have additional questions on the presentation, which was really helpful, but more on, like my step, an example, and maybe you wanted to discuss with us today. For example, on the ARP, we had decided there's 5 different priorities. And one of the things that has happened this year, I mean, I've attended all of your board meetings, so you haven't seen me, I've attended them on Zoom. And there were many things that hit you that were unexpected. you know, it was really the result of the pandemic. There's no question about that. And so when we're looking at where we start to put that money, I guess I'm suggesting we have that conversation about what you learned this year that may change what we had advised you and what the community had advised you last year. You understand what I'm kind of trying to get at? I just think it's a really important, so for example, on security would be the example of, you know, are there things that you would rather have now that you've been through what you've been through? Are there things that you feel really are priorities that may not have been taken into account?
So let me make sure that I understand what you're asking. We did have a lot of unanticipated funds, items that came up that we had to cover. I think most immediate in terms of like PPE, when we needed the equipment, and I won't say equipment, but we needed to purchase masks, we needed to purchase gowns, we needed gloves, we needed, you know, the booties, depending on, you know, what the person's role was. We purchased the handheld thermometers, we purchased our shields, we did a lot of things that were truly one-time expenses, but yet it was an expense that we had to incur. If I'm not mistaken, the question is then, are we planning for those types of expenses, and how are we planning for those types of expenses that may occur? That's something that we have to do along the way, because we have to, you know, we don't have a crystal ball, but we have a proverbial crystal ball. And so then we have to look at what are some areas where we may need to have a higher estimate of what we're going to budget for that. So do we bake that into the budget? Yes, we do, because we know that there may be some unanticipated costs that we will need to cover.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. Also, that there may have been other things. I'm still thinking about security, or it's really probably more on the social emotional stuff that, you know, I mean, all of us have suffered in this pandemic, and our children and our young people show the symptoms of it very clearly. And, you know, are there things that now we've learned that we need to emphasize that maybe we didn't know about last year? That's all I'm commenting on.
So if I'm understanding the second piece, are you asking if, given where we have been this year,
Right.
6 months in, would there be a different set of priorities going into 22, 23?
Right, or maybe not a different set, because those are very broad priorities, but the way you allocate it, or just, you know, as we look through that, we probably need to know how much is being spent, or you planning, or you're suggesting is spent on one priority over another, and would there be a shift in where one thing maybe needs more support than you thought it did originally? That kind of thing.
One thing that I can say is that the priorities that were established are still the priorities today. Yeah. We are seeing a huge need for our social emotional learning. So yes, that may increase based on what we've already budgeted, but looking at now that we are working through the training and we are looking at the implementation piece with our students, we may see that we need to increase that. And then that means that something else may need to be reduced because, you know, for example, when we talk about accelerated learning, we are looking at strategies that have been implemented where we're seeing the gains of those strategies. So now it's a matter of just continuing with those strategies. And there may not be, we may not need to do the amount of professional development that we started with because we're launching that, but now it's more embedded in the practice. So then those dollars we can either use for somewhere else or project those dollars moving forward. I mean, we would have some options. We know that safety and security is huge. We are always looking for, and this is my shameless plug, but we always have our positions for hall monitors that are open. We will always need work with our custodial staff, and so those positions are open. We're almost full with meeting the budgeted amount that we have, but that doesn't mean that as we see increases in the needs for safety and security, might we grow and say we need to have 5 more hall monitors. I will say that a number of those positions are vacancies. We've had them on the books. We've had the budget lines for them. We just haven't had the people to fill them. And so we are actively recruiting. And as you know, there's a labor shortage. And so that's where some of that discernment happens when we talk about vacancies. Because if we don't have, even though we are actively recruiting and we are really, trying to interview people and get them in and have them pass the fingerprinting and the background checks, et cetera, even though we are working to fill those positions, we still have vacancies because we don't have enough people applying to fill those vacancies. So that may be an area that we look at depending on the position, because those are also dollars that we can reallocate either within that same area or to another area.
I want to maybe make sure, and it's probably for more of clarification, make sure that I understand. If you could go back to the overarching picture of the budget. And I will say, while I'm familiar with budgeting within education at the higher education level, how the state funds higher education is certainly complicated for us to understand. So I appreciate all the time that you've taken to kind of walk us through some of the outline. But just from my understanding, it looks like relative to what you expect the state to budget on the revenue side versus what the modified rollover budget looks like. It looks like right now there's about $1.5 million worth of wiggle room, right? That you're under what you expect in terms of revenue. Am I understanding that correct?
Yes, our expense projection at this time is $1.67 million higher than where we are anticipating our total revenue at this time based on the governor's proposed budget.
Got it. So 1.7 million is higher. Got it.
And so you still have to understand within that process, though, now we are meeting almost daily with our legislators because they are looking at what those priorities are. So we have, different groups of superintendents are meeting with our delegation as well as delegations from across the state. We are members of the Big Five, which also helps because we all have commonalities with regard to things that we advocate for. And so as we do that advocacy, there may or may not be an increase from the governor's budget. So we are absolutely, while we are very thankful for all the items that we have received with regard to the increase in foundation aid, the increase in dollars for social emotional care, we look at our E&L population, which is growing. And so we look for funding to support that. We look for our full day K, our pre-K dollars to be matching what adopters now are getting. We were early adopters and we're still funded at the earlier rate, which is some $4,000 to $5,000 less than what those who sign on for pre-K now. That's been an advocacy point since I have been here and before me. And our legislators are fully aware of it and they are working on that particular item. because they know how important pre-K is across the board. And so we know that that's a point of advocacy. We also know that the charter school piece with regard to communities that are oversaturated with charter schools and how those dollars are really disenfranchising public school systems with the oversaturation in a community. We've never said that we don't agree that parents should have choice, and we agree with that. However, it can't be to the detriment of the public school system. And so when a community is oversaturated, then there becomes that cost burden that we expense here in our district, just as many other large districts do. So those are two components that we are still going to advocate for, while we are thankful and appreciative to everything that our legislators have done to get us this far. We are so very excited about that. We know that there's still areas that we need to work on. And so those are definitely two of our areas that we know we need to work on and still advocate on behalf of our school district. And so those meetings are held. We had one today, there was one a couple last week. So during this period of time, our legislators are gathering information from their school districts about what else do we need so that they can advocate and look at the budget so that they can see where tweaks can be made. So if there's any increase, then we are very excited about that as well. But just know that that advocacy doesn't stop just because we have the executive budget proposal. It now has to go through the Assembly and the Senate. It has to go through both houses. And so they are gathering information so that they can make decisions based on what they would then advocate for within the school district's budgets.
No, does the district get feedback around, the likelihood that this can move through the state system as it's currently being proposed?
Absolutely. I mean, so not this year. This year, everything has been really positive, but I will say in previous years, when there were items that were just, because of capacity, because of dollar amounts, because of revenue, where things were, probably not going to happen, they would let us know, okay, we understand and we value this and we respect that, and it's not the rationale that we are objecting to. We have a finite amount of dollars and we can only slice the pie so many ways. So yes, they are very open when we have advocacy and we talk about different things that we need to advocate within our budget. They're very realistic about things that are positive. They're very realistic about, their competing interests. And so this one, we may not be able to accommodate, but we can we can look at what some of the options may be. So I would say, yes, our delegation is phenomenal. I mean, they are just really phenomenal. And we are so very happy that they have been friends of education, because they understand what the need is. They understand it.
Regarding that, I keep wondering, this is on the state level, a systemic problem. The foundation aid, while it's wonderful that finally it's being increased, it's still based on a court case of over 10 years ago. And so for me, that money that is owed to the school district is really lowballing it. And how you can see it is by the fact that your modified budget without any other increases is still more than this first year's foundation aid. Mm-hmm. That is telling. And I think when you're advocating, or that's one of the points that you can make, that there's still a problem. And I won't even go into the problem of inequity between poor urban districts and wealthy suburban districts, which is still there despite all. So
Understood. Understood. Thank you for that.
Any other questions or comments this evening?
No, I guess the only other question that keeps lingering in my mind is where on the cost driver side, which is, year over year from what we see, right, 7% more than what was spent last year. What line items have flexibility for the district, and where might there be room if perchance, right, the executive sponsored budget doesn't move through? Where would the district have the most flexibility to cut expenses or expected expenses for next year?
First of all, I would say we would immediately look at the amount of money that we are looking to absorb from our one-time funds. We may have to pull back on some of those and hold them in one-time funds in the ARP money or Sarissa money. We may have to, that's the COVID relief money. We may have to hold on to a portion of that for another year. And that's something that we are prepared to do if that's what we need to do. So I would say first, because you have to understand, some of those cost drivers are driven by a formula, and we aren't going to be able to change those cost drivers. So, if there is flexibility within those cost drivers, absolutely, we would look to reduce those. But most of them, that amount is pretty much set. So for example, when you look at our overall foundation aid, we have $4.5 million right off the top for community schools. That's right off the top. I'm not going to be able to negotiate any of that away because that is earmarked for community schools. So it's things like that that we have to make sure that we keep an eye on. But I think one of the first things that we would look at is how much of the positions or programs that we're looking to absorb in the general fund from the one-time federal dollars, we'd have to pull back on those. And what that means is carry it for another year and then look at some decisions that may have to be made with regard to, do we continue with certain programs or do we modify them and deliver them differently? We may have to think about that, as we look to carry over money for the next year. But hopefully it won't come to that.
I have a question about the healthcare, just in terms of like with the salaries. You said there's step increases, and it seems like maybe they're sort of relatively predictable in terms of what the expenses would be. And I'm curious about healthcare expenses for employees, especially like now going through COVID, if those are predictable, if they've been changing a lot. And also, if like every employee has healthcare, or if there's some kind of way they can opt out, or like there's a buyback, like any way that, to bring those expenses down a little bit. And also, how often are they negotiated? Because I know that, like, I guess the employment is negotiated over multiple year contracts, and just how the healthcare is contracted and how that works with the employment contracts and things. Thank you.
So Albany is a self-insured district. Our expenses are based on use. The increases that we saw for 21-22 in health insurance was about 10% year over year. The anticipated increase going into 22-23 is down to 4%, which is significant. Typically in a consortia or a community rated plan, you're going to see anything from 7 to 15% year over year. So we're really pleased to see that right now we're only anticipating 4% increase going into next year. So it's not negotiated the same way that our salary agreements are negotiated. We do have, as part of our employment contracts, a requirement to provide insurance to our employees. There are buyback options, but that includes documentation that you have insurance through another source. So you can't opt out and not be covered. Does that help answer the question?
Yes, thank you. So do those expenses generally go up every year?
Yes. Health insurance is something we expect to grow every single year, and that's been true for the 20 years I've been doing this work, yes.
And I'm just curious, what does it mean to be self-insured? You said it's based on use. Why does the district do that, or how is that different from maybe how it's done elsewhere? I don't know that much about it. I'm just curious how that was set up and why, if you know.
So I am a novice in self-insurance myself. This decision was made some time ago by the district to be a self-insured employer. There are other districts who choose that path as well. Typically, it's established as a less expensive route at that time anyways, when the decision is made. And so that just means that our experience rating is ours alone, whereas if you were in a consortia or a community rated plan, the experience of every organization or company that participates influences that cost increase year over year. Did that help at all?
Yes, thank you. I also, don't understand health insurance that much. So yes, that was helpful. So do we, basically our district does this self-insured, we're just alone, or do we have, I don't know how it works. Are we with other districts and we can bargain or anything like that?
So we are independent, and we do utilize the expertise of a third-party administrator to really oversee our plan and help us identify opportunities for savings and or make sure that we have the right coverage. So that it's not something that we independently administer. We do have that partner who is an expert for us that helps us navigate the self-insured state, but we are independent of other organizations and districts.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions this evening? Comments?
I have one question that is about a very small item. It's the anticipated increase in Medicaid reimbursement. And I am curious if you know where that came from. Just in terms of, is that because fewer kids were getting reimbursement or services last year? Is this something that's relatively steady? And that money, is that used to pay for those student services, first of all? And second of all, if a student needs those services but doesn't qualify for Medicaid, is that something that we just pay for out of our general fund?
So I'm going to ask if you could email me your question, because we're getting very technical right now. And I want to make sure that I am comprehensive in answering that question, and then we can share that back out as part of our update to the committee next meeting. Would that be okay?
Yes, that sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Once we have the legislative input and everything has been finalized, then you'll start to see the decisions come into fold, because right now this is very early. We are still working to align with the governor's proposed budget, but when we have the actual run, then you'll see more back and forth with regard to here's what we are able to do. There may be some limitations. It may be that, you know what, based on where we are, based on what we're looking to absorb, we have prioritized this, and here's what we are recommending as staff for sustainability. There may or may not be a lot of asks on top of what we can, afford for this year with this second wave of foundation aid funding. So we have to be very conservative. We have to make sure that we are operating with sustainability in mind, because we know that if we can't sustain it, then our kids will suffer for that. And that's not what we want. So at the end of the day, we're looking at where we can absorb positions and programs in order to sustain them in the best interest of our students. And so we'll have to look at that a little bit more closely as we move forward. Ms. Roaring, is there anything that you would like to add?
I am all set, Superintendent Adams.
Okay. Any questions for next time? I know that we have a question that's going to come via email. We'll provide the detailed explanation to that. We'll have that ready to go. Are there any items that you would like for us to follow up on for next time?
One not relatively small one is on transportation aid. Did they increase our transportation aid to reflect the new law regarding being able to transport kids that are, less than the 1.5 million?
So while we have the new law for the child safety zones, there's a next step. And that means that the regulation has to be worked on with regard to the criteria. So yes, we have the law, but now we have to work on the regulation. And of course, we are advocating with regard to that DOT takes a look at that so that we can start working in alignment with that criteria, which has yet to be developed. So there's a second piece to that. So as a district, we can't really act within the law right now because we don't have the regulation which specifies criteria and any changes in that criteria right now. But that's our next step. Mm-hmm.
My only footnote to that one would be that transportation aid is based on prior year expense. So 22-23 aid would be reflective of our 21-22 actual expense.
Okay.
And so from the 21 right now in the executive budget proposal, we do see an increase in the transportation because it does include summer. So we do see a slight increase with regard to transportation in terms of the executive budget proposal, but not in conjunction with the child safety zone.
I guess one question I have also, are there any other costs associated with all the proposals about feeder, the elementary school, all of that work that you're doing?
Not at this time. We're still working through the feeder alignment committee.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's for probably a future year anyway, but.
And then based on what that looks like, then we would be working with First Student to see how that changes. And then that would be within the contract with First Student that we would be looking at, as well as CDTA.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you all so very much. We appreciate all your questions. Again, if you need to email us, please feel free to email us questions. Even if you think of something after the fact, go ahead and send it to us because that can help us set the stage for our next meeting. Okay? Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thanks so much.
Good night.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.